Have you ever wondered why, even though you try to do the right thing, there is still a silent emptiness inside you, as if something essential is out of place? As if his prayers were no more than the ceiling, as if his spiritual life was always on the verge of something greater, but never reached. There is an uneasiness that appears in the quietest moments, when everything slows down and you realize that you may be living only a part of what God really expects of you. And that feeling doesn't scream, it whispers. It appears when you lay your head on the pillow and go over the day, when you remember decisions that could have been different, when you feel like you're doing too much. But it is still not enough. It is like walking in circles, like trying to fill something invisible with visible efforts. Time passes, the days repeat themselves, and deep down there is a question that never goes silent. Am I really honoring God, or just living on automatic? The most disturbing thing is that there is an answer to this. There is a way of living that completely changes this feeling, a spiritual key that is not hidden in something complicated, but that remains invisible to those who have never been taught to see. Something simple but profound. Old but forgotten. Present in the words of Jesus, but ignored by the majority. What if I told you that the problem is not in how much you do, but in the way you live every detail? What if honoring God is not about specific moments, but about a constant posture that changes everything, including what no one sees? There is a path that transforms the ordinary into the sacred, that brings meaning where there was confusion before, and peace where there was weight. What will be revealed here is not a theory. It is no longer a religious explanation. It is a living spiritual code, something that, when understood and practiced, changes the way you relate to God in an immediate and profound way. And perhaps, even today, before you go to sleep, something inside you begins to line up like never before. Stay until the end, because what is behind it may be just what was missing for your life to finally get into the right place before God. John 14:23. If anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him. Along this path you will realize something that has perhaps never been explained so clearly. Honoring God is not about doing more, but about living differently. Here, you'll discover deep spiritual principles that strengthen faith, bring direction in times of doubt, and reveal how God works in details that many overlook. Each part will touch specific areas of your life, from silent thoughts to decisions that change destinies. And as you keep watching, something starts to happen inside. It's not just information, it's an awakening. It's as if every word is reaching exactly the point you need today. And there's something important about that. God can use you to take that message to others. So, like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. Your action can be the bridge for someone to find God again. 1 Samuel 16:7. For the Lord does not see as man sees. Man sees the outward, but the Lord the heart. There is a part of your life that no one sees, a quiet place where your choices do not receive applause, where your decisions are not recognized, where there is no one watching except God. And it is exactly in this place that true honor begins to be built. Because it's easy to look strong in front of people, it's easy to maintain a semblance of faith when everyone is watching. But what defines your spiritual life isn't what you show. It's what you do when you're alone. There is an invisible altar being raised within you every day. And the question that few have the courage to face is, what is being placed on this altar? Thoughts that you feed, attitudes that no one notices, choices that seem small, but that carry an eternal weight. It is in this hidden space that silent battles take place, where temptations arise without warning, and where quick decisions reveal who you really are before God. What Jesus taught about the secret is not just advice, it is a deep spiritual principle. He revealed that there is a reward that does not come from human recognition, but from something much greater, something that begins to move when no one is watching. This changes everything because it means that every hidden moment carries a spiritual potential that many ignore. And maybe you felt it without realizing it. That restlessness when you do something you know you shouldn't, or that inexplicable peace when you choose the right one, even if no one knows. This is no coincidence. It is your soul responding to a higher call. Honoring God in secret is saying no when it would be easier to say yes. It's standing firm when no one would know if you gave in. It's choosing the truth even when it costs. There is a force being built in this invisible place. A firmness that does not depend on opinions, a faith that is not shaken by external circumstances. Because when you learn to live before God in secret, you don't need external validation to keep going. Your motivation changes, your consciousness aligns, and your life begins to gain a consistency that can't be shaken easily. And the most powerful thing about all of this is that what is built in silence begins to appear effortlessly. What is born in the secret sustains what will be revealed in the public. It's not about appearance, it's about essence. It's not about performance, it's about truth. And few actually live it, because it requires discipline, conscience, and a heart willing to be true to God. Perhaps as you listen to this, something is being confronted within you. Maybe there's an area of your life that needs to be adjusted, a habit that needs to be dropped, a decision you've been putting off. And this is not by chance. There is an invitation being extended now, not to change what others see, but to transform what only God knows. Matthew 6:6. But when you pray, go into your room, and when you have shut your door, pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. If this message is touching you in a different way, don't ignore it. It may be just the time God chose to speak to you. And if something inside you has awakened now, write in the comments, Amen, because sometimes a simple answer is already the first step to real change. There is a level of faith that cannot be explained, only lived. It is when God asks for something that does not make sense, when the direction seems to contradict everything you expected, when obeying seems more difficult than retreating. And that's exactly where many stop, because while everything is clear, following God seems easy. But when logic disappears, the decision becomes real. There is a profound difference between believing in God and trusting Him. Believing is comfortable. It does not require rupture. It does not change internal structures. But trusting requires surrender. It requires giving up control. It requires walking without understanding. It requires continuing, even when the mind tries to create arguments to give up. And it is at this point that true honor begins to be revealed. Because honoring God is not only doing what is convenient, it is not following when everything cooperates, it is not obeying only when there is confirmation. To honor God is to stand firm when everything inside you asks you to stop. It is to continue even with a heavy heart, even without answers, even without guarantees. There are times in life when God will not explain, He will ask. And the request does not come to destroy you, it comes to reveal how far your confidence goes. Because many times, what you hold on to so tightly may be occupying a place that should be His. And while this is not delivered, there is a limit to what can be lived spiritually. The deepest of all this is to understand that God never asks for something without purpose. Even when it feels like loss, there is construction. Even when it seems silent, there is movement. Obedience that defies logic isn't about understanding the path, it's about trusting the one who's leading. And maybe you're in exactly that kind of moment right now. A difficult decision, an uncertain path, a feeling that God is directing you to something you still can't fully understand. And this generates conflict, generates doubt, even generates fear. But it also reveals a rare opportunity to live a level of intimacy with God that few experience. Because when you choose to obey without understanding, you access a level of faith that transforms your life from the inside out. Your confidence is no longer based on circumstances and becomes grounded in something eternal. And that changes everything. It changes your way of thinking, reacting, deciding. Genesis 22:2. Take now your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and offer it there as a burnt offering. If that word is stirring something inside you, maybe it's because God is calling you to a new level of trust. If you feel this call, write in the comments, "Speak, Lord, your servant hears." Make it a sincere prayer. And leave your like on this video, because your attitude can help this message reach someone who also needs to take this step of faith today. There is something that few people realize, but that completely changes the way God sees a life. It's not just what you do, it's why you do it. Two people can have the same attitude, say the same words, even follow the same paths. But before God, they are completely different. Because while man observes actions, God examines intentions. And this is uncomfortable, because it breaks a silent illusion. The idea that it is enough to do the right thing to be okay. But the truth is deeper. It is possible to do the right thing with the wrong heart. It is possible to help someone and deep down want recognition. It is possible to pray, to talk about God, even to appear spiritual, and yet be far from that which truly honors God. There is a place within you that no one can fully access, a space where your true motivations are born, where decisions are formed even before they become visible, and it is exactly there that God looks. Not with superficial judgment, but with absolute precision. Nothing goes unnoticed, nothing can be masked. And perhaps the strongest of all this is to realize that God does not reject people for external flaws, but confronts what is misaligned inside. Because when the intention is pure, even the mistake turns into learning. But when the intention is corrupted, even the hit loses value. Honoring God in everything requires constant internal review. It's not just about correcting attitudes, but about aligning the heart. Questions begin to arise inevitably. Why am I doing this? Who is it really for? Is there truth in this or just appearance? And these questions are not to generate guilt, but awareness. Because when the intention is adjusted, everything changes. The way of speaking changes, the way of acting changes, even the way of thinking begins to transform. You stop living to be seen and start living to truly please God. And this brings a lightness that cannot be explained, only lived. There is a freedom in not having to prove anything to anyone, to know that even if no one recognizes it, God sees. Even if no one understands, God does. And that's enough. This sustains, this strengthens. Psalm 24:3-4. Who shall ascend into the mountain of the Lord? He who is clean in hands and pure in heart. And perhaps at this moment, the most important thing is not to try to change everything at once, but simply to be true before God. If this makes sense to you, write in the comments a simple but powerful phrase: God sees my heart. Sometimes a heartfelt statement is the beginning of a profound transformation. There is a silent trap that prevents many people from growing spiritually. Waiting for great opportunities to start taking God seriously. The idea that when something bigger happens, when life changes, when there is more recognition, then it will finally be time to live with more surrender. But what few realize is that God never starts with the big. He always starts with the small. And this completely changes the way we see our own life. Because the details that seem insignificant are actually the places where everything is being decided. The way you react to a simple situation, the way you position yourself when no one is watching, the choices that seem to have no importance. All of this is building something invisible, but extremely powerful. There is a spiritual pattern that does not fail. Before entrusting something big, God observes the behavior in the small. Not as someone who tests out of curiosity, but as someone who trains, prepares, and strengthens. Because what you do today, in the simplest situations, reveals who you will be when something bigger arrives. And perhaps the most challenging point of all this is to realize that true fidelity is almost never accompanied by recognition. There is no applause, there is no validation, there are no immediate rewards. Often there is silence, and it is exactly in this silence that many give up, because they seem not to be seen, they do not seem to be advancing, but there's something going on that the natural eye can't perceive. Every faithful attitude, every right choice, every moment when you decide to honor God in a little is being accurately recorded. Nothing is ignored, nothing is lost. There is a construction being made, layer by layer, forming a base that cannot be shaken. Honoring God in everything involves understanding that there are no insignificant moments. Everything matters, from the simplest words to the most discreet decisions. Because consistency in the small creates an inner strength that sustains the big when it arrives. And when that understanding becomes real, something changes inside you. The need for recognition decreases, the anxiety for immediate results loses strength, and a new posture begins to emerge. A firm, constant posture that does not depend on external circumstances to continue. Luke 16:10. He who is faithful in what is least is faithful also in much. If you've made it this far, it's no accident. There is something being adjusted within you, something that can completely transform the way you live your faith. And at the end of this path, there is a moment that can mark a before and after in your spiritual life. Let's pray together, deeply and sincerely, seeking strength, direction, and renewal. Stay with me until the end, because this may be the moment you needed to truly align yourself with God. There is a moment when life puts you against the wall, a silent moment when no one is looking, no one is judging, no one is stopping you. And yet, something inside you knows exactly what's at stake. Temptation rarely appears in a frightening way. It presents itself in a subtle, attractive, almost justifiable way. She talks to your desires, negotiates with your emotions, and tries to convince you that this time it's okay. And it is precisely there that the honor of God is put to the test. Not when everything is easy, not when the path is clear, but when there is a real opportunity to choose the mistake without apparent consequences. When it seems that no one will find out, when it seems that it will not make a difference, when the mind begins to create arguments to lighten the weight of the decision. But there is something deeper going on right now. It's not just a choice between right and wrong, it's a definition of who you're becoming. Each time you give in, something inside you weakens. And each time you resist, something inside you strengthens invisibly, but really. Honoring God in the midst of pressure is not denying that temptation exists. It is recognizing that it has no authority over you. It is to feel the conflict and yet choose what is right. It is to understand that there are decisions that do not only affect the now, but shape your spiritual future. The most challenging thing is that resisting is often expensive. It can mean giving up something you wanted. It can mean going against strong impulses. It can even bring immediate discomfort. But there is one truth that sustains those who choose to stand firm. Nothing is worth more than the peace of being aligned with God. Because after the moment has passed, what remains is not the missed opportunity, but the clear conscience or the weight of the wrong choice. And those who learn to honor God in these moments begin to live with a different freedom, a strength that does not depend on circumstances. There is a spiritual maturity that is only born in this type of decision, a level of firmness that cannot be taught with words, only developed in practice. And the more you choose to resist, the stronger you become, until you realize that what once seemed impossible now no longer has the same power over you. Genesis 39:9. How then shall I do such wickedness and sin against God? If this message spoke to you in a personal way, it may be because you are facing or have faced this type of battle from within. Then state in the comments, "Lord, I receive your teachings." Write it as a decision act. And leave your like on this video, because this message might be just what someone else needs to win a silent fight today. There is a silent difference between living trying to get it right and living being guided. Many people want to do God's will, but they feel lost, as if they are walking in an environment full of voices, opinions, thoughts, and feelings that mix all the time. And in the midst of all this, a doubt arises that almost no one admits. How do you know when God is speaking? Because God's voice does not always come as clearly as many imagine. Most of the time it is soft, almost imperceptible, and therefore easily ignored. It does not compete with the noise of the world. It does not force attention. It does not scream to be heard. And that is exactly why so many are confused, not for lack of faith, but for lack of sensitivity. Honoring God in everything involves learning to recognize this voice. And this does not happen automatically. It is developed. It is a process of adjusting the heart, slowing down the mind, and creating space to perceive what previously went unnoticed. Because the more distracted someone is, the less they can discern. There is a type of error that is not born of rebellion, but of haste. Decisions made without direction, choices made without peace, paths followed only by logic or emotion. And then comes the weight, the doubt, the feeling that something is not right. This happens when God's voice is ignored or not even perceived. But there is a different way, a place where the person begins to perceive small signs, subtle directions, a peace that confirms, or a restlessness that alerts. It is not something mystical or distant. It is a real connection that is built over time. The more you learn to listen, the clearer it becomes. And this completely changes the way of living. Decisions are no longer based only on what feels right and are guided by something deeper. There arises a security that does not depend on circumstances. A confidence that does not come from external guarantees, but from the certainty that God is leading. The most interesting thing is that this voice is not far away. It was always present. The problem was never God not speaking, but how much people were willing to listen. And when that key turns, everything starts to line up in a way that once seemed impossible. 1 Samuel 3:10. Speak, Lord, for your servant hears. If this message has already begun to touch something inside you, this is already a sign that God is approaching in a personal way, and you can be a part of something bigger now. When you like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. This word reaches other people who are also in need of hearing God's voice. Do this now, and allow this message to continue to reach lives. There is a point in the spiritual walk that cannot be avoided, only faced. A place where following God is no longer comfortable and starts to require something deeper, surrender. Not that delivery of words, not that promise made in emotional moments, but a real decision to give up one's own will to live something greater. And this is the point where many stop. Because as long as it is possible to reconcile one's own desires with faith, everything seems to work. But when the time comes when we have to choose, when personal will conflicts with God's leading, something within us resists. A silent struggle arises, an internal confrontation that no one sees, but that defines everything. To resign is not to lose, but it almost always seems to be. It is giving up paths that would make sense, choices that would be easier, decisions that would bring immediate comfort. And that's exactly why it's so difficult. Because the mind tries to justify, tries to negotiate, tries to find a way to maintain control. But there is a truth that few understand until they live it. As long as you insist on maintaining control, you limit what God can do. Because His plan does not fit within your will, it is your will that needs to align with His plan. Honoring God in everything goes through this level of trust. Not just trust when everything is fine, but trust when the direction requires sacrifice. When following God means going against what you would like, against what you imagined, against what seemed right in your own eyes. And the deepest thing about it all is that true transformation happens exactly at this point. Not when you do what you want, but when you decide to obey even though you don't want to. It is in this place that something changes inside you. Your faith matures, your vision broadens, your relationship with God becomes more real. Because deep down, the greatest proof of love is not in words, but in surrender. It is in the decision to say, even with a heavy heart, that God's will is greater, that His plans are better, even when they are not understood at the moment. Luke 22:42. Father, if you are willing, let this cup pass from me, yet not my will, but yours, be done. And maybe, as you listen to this, someone has come to your mind, someone who needs to learn to trust more, someone who is facing a difficult decision, someone who needs the strength to truly surrender to God. Write that person's name in the comments. Let's together form a chain of prayer, placing these lives before God in faith, believing that something can begin to change from this simple but purposeful attitude. There comes a time when everything is no longer divided into parts. There is no longer God's time and life's time. There is no longer what is spiritual and what is common. Everything begins to mix, and this is exactly where many cannot move forward, because they still try to separate what God has never separated. Honoring God in everything is not living isolated moments of faith. It is transforming one's own life into a continuous expression of this surrender. This completely changes the way we see everyday life. Small decisions are no longer automatic. Words start to have more weight. Attitudes begin to reflect something deeper. It is no longer a matter of doing something for God at certain times, but of living with God at all times. At work, at home, in silence, in conversations, in the most discreet thoughts. And it is at this point that faith ceases to be something theoretical and becomes practical, because it's no use talking about God and living disconnected from Him. True honor comes when what you believe in begins to influence everything you do, not out of obligation, but out of conscience, not by pressure, but by transformation. There is a surrender that goes beyond words, a daily decision to live in an aligned way, even in the simplest things. And this requires attention, because it's easy to get lost in routine, to act on automatic, to react without thinking. But when you understand that your whole life is an altar, everything changes. Each choice becomes meaningful, each attitude carries intention. And this is not weight, it is purpose. It is not a constant demand, it is a living awareness that God is present in all details. And when this reality becomes clear, life takes on a new meaning. The ordinary becomes sacred, the simple becomes meaningful. The day-to-day is no longer just routine and becomes a continuous space of connection with God. Romans 12:1. I beseech you that you present your bodies as a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your reasonable worship. And perhaps you are beginning to realize that honoring God is not something distant, it is not something reserved for the few, but a daily invitation that is within your reach now, in every choice, in every word, in every thought. And this awareness can completely transform the way you live from today. Nothing happens by chance. If you have come this far, it is because there is something being awakened within you. Stay until the end, because there is a moment prepared that can deeply mark your spiritual life and take you to a level of surrender that you may never have experienced before. There is a kind of phase in life when everything seems undefined. You pray, You look for direction, you try to understand the signs, but there are no clear answers. The path ahead seems cloudy, decisions become more difficult, and the feeling of not having control begins to bother you. And it is exactly in this environment that many feel lost, as if God is silent, as if He is not showing the next step. But there is a truth that completely changes this perception. God does not reveal the entire path. He reveals enough for the next step. And this is not a lack of direction, it is a way of teaching dependence. Because as long as there is total control, there will be no complete trust. Honoring God in the midst of uncertainty is continuing to walk even without having all the answers. It is taking a step without seeing the end. It is continuing to trust even when the mind asks for guarantees. And that directly confronts our nature because we want security, we want clarity, we want to know exactly where we're going. But divine direction works differently. It does not anticipate, it manifests itself in movement. While you are standing there waiting to understand everything, nothing happens. But when you decide to move forward with what has already been revealed, even if it seems little, something begins to line up. There is a spiritual construction in this process. Every step you take in trust strengthens something inside you. Every decision made without relying on logic increases your spiritual sensitivity. And little by little you realize that you don't need to see everything, you just need to trust the one who is guiding. The most challenging thing is to accept that there will not always be immediate confirmation. There will not always be clear signs, nor will there always be that emotional certainty that many expect to feel. Sometimes the only thing you have is a quiet conviction that you need to keep going. And that's enough. Because God's presence does not depend on your understanding, it depends on your willingness to follow. When you decide to honor God, even without understanding it, you enter a level of relationship where trust becomes stronger than the need for control. And little by little, what seemed confusing begins to make sense. Paths open, directions align, and you realize that you were never lost. You were just being led in a way that required more faith than vision. Exodus 13:21. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light. There is a part of life that almost no one likes to touch because it hurts, because it exposes, because it reveals what has been hidden for a long time. They are old wounds, unresolved disappointments, feelings that have been kept silent. And the most dangerous thing is that over time, the person learns to live with it as if it were normal, as if they didn't need a cure. But God does not work only in what is visible. He goes straight to the interior. And that's exactly where many turn away from the process, because they prefer a quick fix on the outside than a deep transformation on the inside. They want immediate relief, but they don't want to face what needs to be addressed. Honoring God also involves allowing Him to touch these areas, and that requires humility. Because the healing of the soul does not begin with strength, it begins with surrender. It starts when you recognize that you need help, that there are things inside you that are not right, that need to be restored. The most challenging thing is that God does not always act the way we expect. Sometimes He uses simple paths, processes that seem small, instructions that don't make sense at first glance. And that's when pride rises, trying to convince that it's not enough, that it should be different, grander, more immediate. But there is a spiritual secret to this. True healing is not in the appearance of the process, but in obedience to it. When you accept God's treatment, even if you don't fully understand it, something begins to align within you. Layers are being removed, weights are being broken, and a new lightness begins to emerge. And it's not something instantaneous, it's a path, a continuous process where God restores, adjusts, rebuilds. And the more you allow yourself to live that, the more you realize that it's not just about feeling better, it's about becoming someone different. because untreated wounds influence decisions, shape behaviors, distort perceptions. But when God heals, He doesn't just ease the pain. He transforms the way you view life, people, and even yourself. Honoring God in everything includes trusting that He knows exactly what needs to be dealt with and how to do it. Even if it touches sensitive areas, even if it confronts parts you'd rather avoid, because in the end, the goal is not to expose, it's to restore. 2 Kings 5:13. My father, if the prophet had told you a great thing, would you not have done it? How much more when he said to you, wash and you will be clean? And maybe that message has come to you because there's something inside that God wants to heal. If this spoke to your soul in any way, write in the comments, I trust in God. Sometimes, a simple step of faith makes room for a profound process of transformation. There is a moment in life when a person realizes that they have moved away. Not suddenly, not overnight, but gradually. Small decisions, almost imperceptible choices, distractions that seemed harmless, and when he realizes he no longer feels the same connection, the same sensitivity, the same closeness to God. And the hardest thing is not just recognizing this distance, but dealing with what comes with it, the guilt, the shame, the feeling that maybe you've gone too far to come back. The mind begins to create barriers, saying that now it is different, that it is no longer the same as before, that perhaps God no longer sees the same way. But there's one truth that breaks it all down. It's never been about how far you've come. It's always been about the decision to come back. Honoring God also goes through this moment. It's not just about standing firm, but about having the courage to return when you realize you've strayed. And this requires more than words. It requires humility. It requires acknowledging without justifying, returning without negotiating, abandoning the pride that tries to keep everything as it is. Spiritual return is not an external event. It is an internal movement. It starts within, in a quiet place, where the person decides that he no longer wants to live far away. And this decision, as simple as it may seem, carries enormous spiritual weight. Because when someone decides to come back for real, something already starts to happen. Even before any visible change, even before any external attitude, the heart already begins to align again. And it is at this point that many are surprised because they expected rejection, but find acceptance. God doesn't just allow the return. He waits for it, not with judgment, but with compassion, not with demand, but with grace. And that changes everything because it reveals that reconnection doesn't depend on perfection, it depends on decision. And along with this return comes something even deeper, restoration. Not only of relationship, but of identity. Because when someone moves away, they often also lose themselves. It loses direction, it loses clarity, it loses peace. But when he returns, he begins to rediscover who he really is before God. Not based on mistakes, not defined by failures, but restored by grace. Luke 15:20. And he arose and went to his father, and while he was yet a great way off, his father saw him and was moved with compassion. And maybe this message is reaching you because deep down there is this desire to come back closer, to feel again that connection that seemed so alive before. And if this is happening now, don't ignore it. There is something being restored within you right now. If you are here, it is because God allowed it, and I believe He still has something more to reveal to your heart. Don't leave here before you've received that which can rekindle your faith and put you back on the right path. There is a kind of moment in life that cannot be postponed. An instant when something inside you knows that it needs to act, that you can no longer wait, that remaining silent is no longer an option. And even so, many people hesitate. They think too much, postpone decisions, ignore that internal discomfort without realizing that they are facing a decisive time. Because not all delay is prudence. Sometimes it's escape in disguise. It is the fear of taking a position, of facing consequences, of leaving the comfort zone. And it is at this point that something serious happens. What could be an act of honor turns into omission. Honoring God also involves recognizing the right time to act. Not only living correctly, but realizing when an attitude needs to be taken, when a decision can no longer be postponed. There is a spiritual sensitivity that discerns this, that identifies when the moment has come. And this kind of perception does not come by chance. It is born of a connection with God, of an attentive heart, of a life that is not distracted by everything around it. Because those who live on automatic hardly notice when God is calling for something specific. There are times when silence is necessary, but there are times when silence becomes disobedience, moments in which speaking, taking a stand, acting is not just a choice. It is a calling. And ignoring this can cost more than you think. The most challenging thing is that these moments are often accompanied by risk. They are not comfortable, they are not easy, they do not guarantee immediate results. On the contrary, they require courage, they require faith, they require a willingness to trust God even without knowing how everything will end. But it is exactly in these moments that the purpose is revealed. Because there are doors that only open when someone decides to act. There are situations that only change when someone gets up. There are stories that are only transformed when someone understands that they were put there for a reason. And maybe, without realizing it, you are living one of those moments right now. Something inside you already knows, a decision that needs to be made, an attitude that needs to be assumed, a position that can no longer be avoided. And this feeling is not by chance. There is a purpose attached to this. There is something bigger at stake, and it may all depend on your answer. Esther 4:14. And who knoweth whether thou hast come to this kingdom for such a time as this? If this word touched you in any way, don't ignore it. Perhaps this is exactly your time to take a stand. And if you feel that God has been good, even in the midst of struggles, write in the comments, Amen. A simple word, but one that carries faith, recognition, and decision. There is a way of living that speaks louder than any words. It's not about what you say, but about what you convey without realizing it. That's when your life starts to become a constant message, a visible reflection of something invisible. And this is impossible to be pretended for long, because sooner or later, what is inside reveals itself on the outside. Many people believe that honoring God is only linked to the spiritual environment, to specific moments, to well-placed words. But the truth is that the most powerful honor is the one that appears in everyday life, in the details, in the attitudes that no one applauds, but that everyone observes. Because, without even realizing it, you are being watched. Not just for God, but for the people around you. At work, in the family, in simple conversations, in unexpected reactions. And what do they see? Coherence or contradiction, truth or appearance, light or confusion. Honoring God in front of people is not about trying to appear perfect, but about being true. It is living in such an aligned way that even if someone tries to find fault, they find consistency. Not because you never make mistakes, but because there is an integrity that underpins your choices. And this has a silent but profound impact. Because in a world where everything seems unstable, where values are easily negotiated, a firm life draws attention, not by strength but by constancy, not by speech but by practice. There is something powerful in someone who lives what they believe. That doesn't change depending on who is around, that doesn't negotiate principles to fit in, that doesn't need to prove anything, because your life already speaks for itself. And the most interesting thing is that this type of testimony not only influences, it confronts. He makes people think, question, reflect, not because you impose something, but because your way of living reveals something different. And that is honor. Not the honor that seeks recognition, but the honor that is born of fidelity. the one that remains even when no one validates, even when there is no immediate return, even when it is more difficult to maintain than to give up. Daniel 6:4. Then the presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel, but they could find no occasion or guilt. And maybe, without realizing it, your life is already being an answer for someone. Someone who observes in silence, someone who needs a real example, someone who has not yet found direction, but sees in you something different. This word is not for everyone. If you are here, there is something being worked on within you right now, and what is yet to come can take you to a level of consciousness and transformation that you may never have experienced. Stay, because God still has something specific to speak to your heart. There is a time in life when everything can change unexpectedly. It's not something planned, it's not something you control. But when it happens, it divides your story into before and after. This is when the truth stops being just something you've heard and becomes something that directly confronts who you are. Because there's a difference between living believing you're right and finding out you need to change. And this discovery is not always comfortable. On the contrary, it shakes structures, breaks certainties, dismantles the image you have built of yourself. True transformation begins right there, not when everything is well adjusted, but when something inside you is confronted so deeply that it is no longer possible to continue being the same. And this type of encounter is not superficial. It reaches the interior, changes the way of thinking, of seeing, of living. Honoring God at this level takes courage. Courage to recognize that not everything in you needs to be maintained. Courage to allow God to tinker with areas you've never questioned. Because the biggest barrier to transformation is not in what you do, but in what you believe about yourself. Often the person clings to an old identity, to patterns that have already become familiar, to ways of acting that seem natural. And even when you realize that you need to change, there is an internal resistance, as if giving it up would lose who you are. But the truth is the opposite. When God transforms, He does not take away your identity, He reveals the true one. It removes that which has been built on the basis of experiences, mistakes, and influences, and begins to rebuild something aligned with the original purpose. And this process does not happen from the outside in, but from the inside out. It's not just a change in behavior, it's a change in nature. What once seemed normal begins to bother. What did not make sense before begins to gain clarity. And little by little, a new way of living begins to emerge. The most striking thing about this transformation is that it does not depend on the past. It doesn't matter who you've been, it doesn't matter what you've done, it doesn't matter what path you've taken so far. When this encounter happens, everything can be redirected, and this reveals something powerful. No one is stuck with their old version. There is always the possibility of becoming something new, of living differently, of aligning life with something bigger. Acts 9:5. And he said, "Who are you, Lord?" And the Lord said, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." And maybe, without realizing it, you are living in such a moment right now, a moment of confrontation, of awakening, of perception. Something inside you no longer accepts to continue in the same way, and this is not by chance. It's the beginning of a transformation that can completely redefine who you are from here. There is a silent illusion that makes many people believe that they can live the faith alone, isolated, without depending on anyone. The idea that it is possible to have a strong spiritual life without connection with others seems comfortable, but it hides a dangerous weakness. Because deep down, no one was created to walk alone. Honoring God also involves understanding this. It's not just about your individual relationship with Him, but about how that relationship manifests itself in how you connect with others who share the same faith. There is a force that is only released when there is unity, when there is true communion, when there is a willingness to walk together. And this goes far beyond meetings or punctual moments. It is about sharing life, to be present, to support, to listen, to carry each other's burdens. It is a continuous construction, where each person contributes, where each one strengthens the other, where no one needs to pretend to be well all the time. The problem is that individualism has kept many away from this type of experience. People who prefer to close themselves off, who avoid getting involved, who try to solve everything by themselves, and little by little, without realizing it, they are weakening. Because faith, when isolated, loses strength. It needs connection, it needs exchange, it needs relationship. There is something powerful when people come together for a spiritual purpose. Environments are transformed, strengths are renewed, loads become lighter, not because problems disappear, but because no one has to face them alone. And that is also honor, because when you decide to walk in unity, you are recognizing that God does not only work in the individual, but also in the collective. That he manifests himself through connections, relationships, bonds that strengthen and edify. Acts 2:44. All who believed were together and had all things in common. And maybe this is an area that needs attention in your life. Perhaps there is a call to open up more, to connect, to allow others to walk with you on this journey. Because there are things that will only be experienced when you understand that you don't have to do everything alone. And think about it for a moment. How many people right now are in need of exactly a word like that? Just as it came to you, it can reach someone who is in need of strength, direction, and hope. By liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and activating the bell, you become part of something bigger, helping this message to get where it needs to go. There is a moment when life stops being just about what you want and starts to confront something bigger, what you were called for. And this type of confrontation does not happen on the outside. It happens inside. It's as if suddenly your vision broadens and you begin to realize that there is something beyond routine, beyond daily worries, beyond your own plans. But along with this realization comes a profound impact, because when someone really has an encounter with the presence of God, the first thing that changes is not the world around them, it's the way that person sees themselves. What once seemed sufficient no longer seems so. What was previously ignored begins to bother us. There is a new, more sensitive, more real consciousness. And it is exactly at this point that many retreat, because perceiving is one thing, responding is another. Understanding that there is a calling is different from making yourself available to live it. And the reason is simple. Responding requires surrender. It requires getting out of your comfort zone. It requires giving up control. It requires accepting that you won't have all the answers before you start. Honoring God in everything includes this kind of response. Not partial, not conditional, not based on guarantees, but a sincere delivery where you decide to make yourself available even without understanding all the details. It is saying yes before knowing exactly how it will be. And this goes against everything that the mind tries to control, because we want security, we want predictability, we want to make sure it works. But God's call doesn't work that way. He invites first, reveals later, he calls before explaining, and it is in this space that faith becomes real. There is something powerful when someone decides to respond in this way, because it's not just about doing something for God, but about making yourself available to him. Life is no longer guided only by personal choices and is directed by a greater purpose, and this completely changes the way of living. Priorities are aligned, decisions gain more weight, time is seen differently, because when you understand that you have been called, everything begins to have a new meaning. Isaiah 6:8. After this I heard the voice of the Lord, "To whom shall I send it?" And I said, "Here I am, send me." And perhaps somehow this question is also echoing within you now. Not out loud, but in the silence of his interior, a call that cannot be ignored, a perception that cannot be undone. And the answer you give to that can define the next steps in your life in a way you can't yet fully imagine. There is a point in the spiritual journey when everything stops revolving around results and starts revolving around presence. Because while many seek answers, solutions, and miracles, few realize that the greatest sign of a life aligned with God is not what He does, but how much He is present. And that completely changes the perspective, because when God's presence becomes a priority, fear loses strength, doubt loses space, and the need to prove something to others simply disappears. Not because the challenges cease to exist, but because something greater sustains you inside. There is a security that comes not from circumstances, but from the awareness that God is with you. And this certainty is not born of words, it is born of intimacy. It is not something that is built overnight, but a continuous journey where the presence of God ceases to be something occasional and becomes constant. To honor God in everything is to reach that level, where the most important thing is not the final result, but the certainty that you are not alone in the process. Where the highest priority is not to win a battle, but to stay connected with God in the midst of it. Because it is possible to conquer things and still be empty. It is possible to achieve results and still feel that something is missing. But when God's presence is at the center, even difficult moments carry peace. Even uncertain days have direction. And this reveals a powerful spiritual secret. Those who prioritize presence do not depend on favorable circumstances to remain steadfast. There is an inner stability that is not easily shaken, a confidence that does not fluctuate with the environment. That's the difference between living trying to prove something and living knowing who's with you. When this awareness becomes real, you no longer have to fight to show strength because it already exists within you. 1 Kings 18:37. Answer me, Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you are the Lord God. And perhaps at this moment, what you need most is not an immediate response, but to feel that presence again in a real and close way. Because when that happens, everything starts to line up from the inside out. If this message is confirming something inside you, write in the comments, God takes care of me. State this as a truth about your life, even on days when everything seems uncertain. There is a kind of scenario in life that seems definitive, situations that have reached a point where there is no more expectation, where everything seems dry, without movement, without the possibility of change. These are areas where you've tried, you've prayed, you've waited, and over time he began to believe that there is simply nothing else to do. And the most dangerous thing about this type of situation is not what happened on the outside, but what began to happen on the inside. Hope diminishes, faith begins to weaken, and without realizing it, you stop believing that something can be restored. Accept the scenario as it is, even if deep down it still hurts. But there is something that needs to be understood. God does not work limited by the conditions you see. What seems to you to be the end, to him is still raw material. That which seems dead, for him can still receive life. And it is exactly in this type of environment that God's power is most evidently manifested. Honoring God is also keeping faith when there are no signs. It is to keep believing when everything around says otherwise. It is looking at a hopeless situation and yet choosing to trust that God can act. And that's not easy, because it requires a change of internal posture. It requires not to surrender to what the eyes see, not to accept as definitive what God can still transform. It requires courage to continue declaring life where everything seems stagnant. There is a spiritual force released when someone decides not to agree with the negative scenario, when, even in the midst of pain, he chooses to believe, when, even without proof, he keeps his faith alive. And little by little something begins to happen, first inside, then outside. Hope begins to return, the vision changes, the way of seeing the situation changes. And what seemed completely lost is beginning to show signs of restoration, because God doesn't just bring solutions, He brings life. And life is not just existing, it is moving, it is renewing oneself, it is starting over. Ezekiel 37:5. Thus says the Lord God to these bones, Behold, I will bring in the Spirit into you, and you shall live. And maybe there's an area of your life that looks exactly like this scenario. Something you've already considered closed, something you've already put aside, something that seems to have no way out. But if this message has reached you, perhaps it is time to look again, not with natural eyes, but with faith. What you will listen to next can touch exactly on that area that seemed forgotten. Stay until the end, because God can still bring life where you no longer saw possibility. There is a question that many people avoid asking in depth. Why am I here? Not in the superficial sense, but in the most intimate and true sense. Because when this question is ignored, life begins to be lived on automatic. Days pass, decisions are made, paths are followed. But deep down, there is a feeling that is difficult to explain, as if something is missing. And this emptiness is not about having too little or too much. It is not about achievements or failures. It's about direction. It's about living without clarity of purpose. Because when someone doesn't understand what he was called for, any path seems to do, but none really satisfies. Honoring God in everything begins when this awareness awakens. When you realize that your life is not random, that you are not here by chance, that there is a greater plan in progress, and this completely changes the way we see every detail. Their choices are no longer just personal and start to have a spiritual weight. But there is a challenge in this process. Often, when someone begins to perceive this calling, they also begin to feel insecure. Thoughts such as, I am not capable, I am not prepared, this is not for me, arise with force. And this causes many to retreat even before taking the first step. What needs to be understood is that God's purpose was never based on human ability. It doesn't depend on how much you know, how much you have, or how much you think you can achieve. It depends on the decision to align, to make oneself available, to trust that God sustains what He Himself has established. And when that truth is accepted, something begins to adjust within you. Insecurity loses strength, comparison no longer makes sense, and a new confidence begins to emerge, not in himself, but in the God he called. Living outside of this purpose creates confusion. Decisions become heavy, the path seems uncertain, and the feeling of being lost becomes constant. But when someone begins to live in line with what God has established, everything makes sense. Even challenges start to have purpose, even difficulties begin to teach. There is a spiritual authority that is born when you understand who you are and what you have been called to. It's not arrogance, it's not superiority, it's conviction. It is knowing that your life has value, has direction, and has a role within something much bigger. Jeremiah 1:5. Before I formed you in the womb I knew you, and before you came out of the womb I sanctified you. To the nations I have made you a prophet. And maybe, when you hear this, something starts to make sense inside you, a perception that was dormant, a consciousness that begins to awaken, as if, for the first time, you're beginning to see that your life carries a purpose that goes beyond what you imagined so far. There is a kind of pain that cannot be explained with words. It's not just what happened, but what was left after. An emptiness, a weight in your chest, a feeling that something inside you has been broken. And the most difficult thing is that, in these moments, everything seems to lose its meaning. What was once clear becomes confusing. What brought security no longer sustains. And it is exactly in this place that many begin to move away from God, not because they stop believing, but because they can't understand. Questions arise, the silence seems greater, and the feeling of abandonment tries to take space. But there is a truth that needs to be seen. Pain is not the end of your faith, it can be the beginning of a deeper experience with God. Honoring God is not just about standing firm when all is well. It's about continuing to trust when everything seems to fall apart. It is to keep the heart open even when it is injured, and this is not easy because pain tends to close, to harden, to move away. But when someone decides to do otherwise, something powerful happens. When even in the midst of suffering, a person chooses to draw closer to God instead of moving away, this place of pain is transformed. It doesn't stop hurting immediately, but it starts to have a new meaning. Because God does not ignore broken hearts, He does not turn away from those who are injured. On the contrary, it is at this moment that He draws near in a more real way, not with ready-made answers, but with presence, not just to solve, but to sustain. And little by little, something begins to change. The pain that seemed only destruction begins to reveal something deeper, a greater sensitivity, a truer dependence, a faith that is not based on circumstances but on relationship. There is a level of intimacy with God that is only accessed in this place, where words become more sincere, where masks fall, where faith ceases to be theoretical and becomes real. Job 42:5. With the hearing of my ears I have heard, but now my eyes see you. And maybe, right now, you're in exactly that kind of phase, dealing with something that no one fully understands, carrying a weight that only you feel. But this message did not arrive by chance. There is an invitation being made so that you do not move away, but get even closer. Before we continue, open your heart and write your prayer request in the comments. Put there what has weighed, what needs a response, what you can't carry alone. Let's form a chain of faith together, because when we unite in prayer, something begins to move in a way that goes beyond what we can see. There is a way of seeing life that imprisons without the person noticing. It is when everything is interpreted only by what the eyes see, by what is logical, by what seems evident. Circumstances become the only reference, and when they are negative, fear grows, insecurity dominates, and hope begins to fade. Because, looking only at the natural, many situations really do seem dead-end. Problems seem bigger than they are, challenges seem impossible, and the feeling of being surrounded by difficulties becomes constant. And this is exactly how many live, reacting to what they see, limited to what they can understand. But there is another way of looking at it, a vision that goes beyond the obvious, beyond the immediate, beyond what is in front of the eyes. And this vision is not natural, it is spiritual. She does not ignore reality, but reveals that there is something greater happening at the same time. Honoring God in everything includes developing this kind of discernment. It is not a matter of denying the problems, but of not being dominated by them. It is looking at a difficult situation and still knowing that God is present. It is to realize that even when there are no visible signs, there is an invisible action in progress. The most interesting thing is that this view does not arise automatically. It needs to be developed. And this happens when the person decides not to limit himself to what he feels or what he sees, but begins to seek a deeper perception, more aligned with God. Because fear loses strength when you understand that you are not alone. Anxiety decreases when you realize that there is greater care involved, and faith grows when you begin to see beyond appearances. Many live dominated by what is in front of them, without realizing that there is a spiritual reality happening at the same time. A protection that is not visible, a direction that is not obvious, a care that cannot be measured with natural eyes. And when that awareness becomes real, something changes within you. The way of reacting to situations is transformed. What used to cause despair begins to be faced more calmly. What seemed impossible begins to be seen with hope. 2 Kings 6:17. Lord, please open his eyes that he may see. And behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire. And perhaps at this moment, what you need most is not for circumstances to change immediately, but for your way of seeing to be transformed. Because when your spiritual eyes are opened, you begin to realize that you have never been alone, that you have never been helpless, and that there is so much more going on than what you can see now. There is something that happens every day, but that few realize. Small details, seemingly ordinary situations, unexpected encounters, thoughts that come at the right time, and all this goes unnoticed by those who have not developed spiritual sensitivity. Because God does not always speak in an obvious way, he often reveals himself in the details. And the problem is not that God is not speaking, it is that many are not paying attention. They live distracted, in a hurry, focused only on what is urgent, without realizing that the essential is happening silently. And so signs are ignored, directions are lost, opportunities go unrecognized. Honoring God in everything also involves this level of attention, not as someone who lives in doubt, but as someone who recognizes his dependence. Because there is a difference between questioning out of insecurity and seeking confirmation out of sensitivity. When the heart is aligned, it learns to notice when God is signaling something, and these signs do not always come in the way you expect. Sometimes they come through a simple word, a restlessness that does not leave the heart, a door that opens or closes unexpectedly. Other times, they come through a peace that confirms or a discomfort that alerts. The most important thing is to understand that God communicates. He does not leave those who are willing to listen to him without direction. But this communication requires attention. It requires a willingness to notice. It requires a heart that is not too hardened or distracted to notice. And when that sensitivity starts to develop, something changes. Life no longer seems random. The situations start to make more sense. You begin to notice connections, directions, adjustments that previously went unnoticed. But when these signs are ignored repeatedly, something dangerous happens. The person begins to become insensitive. He no longer perceives with the same clarity. He no longer feels with the same intensity. And this leads to stagnation, to a life without advancement, without clear direction. Therefore, honoring God is also stopping, observing, perceiving. It is learning to value the details, to pay attention to what seems small, not to ignore what touches the heart differently. Judges 6:17. If I have now found favor in your sight, give me a sign that it is you, Lord, who speak with me. And perhaps, if you look closer, you will realize that God has been speaking to you for longer than you think, in details that you almost ignored, in moments that seemed ordinary, but that carried something deeper. If this truth made sense within you, write in the comments, God chose me. Sometimes recognizing this is the first step to begin to see what previously went unnoticed. There is a level of faith that does not depend on results. A faith that is not based on what God does, but on who he is. And this is the faith that is most challenging because it goes against everything we naturally expect. Everyone wants to believe when there are signs, when there are answers, when there is deliverance. But what about when none of this happens? It is at this point that true faith is revealed, when the going gets tough, when the pressure is on, when standing firm seems to cost too much. There is a type of decision that is born in this environment, a silent choice that defines everything. Continue or give in. Because in practice, faith is tested when there is a real possibility of giving it up. When the opportunity arises to facilitate, to negotiate values, to choose a more comfortable path. And it is at this moment that many retreat, not because they stopped believing, but because they cannot stand the pressure. But honoring God in everything requires this level of steadfastness, not a faith that fluctuates according to circumstances, but a conviction that remains even when everything around seems otherwise. It's an internal position that says, no matter what happens, I'm not going to change. And this is not born out of nowhere. This strength is built over time, in small decisions, in invisible moments, in choices that no one sees, until the time comes when this faith is put to the test more intensely. The most powerful thing about this dimension is that it is not tied to results. It doesn't depend on a happy ending to keep believing. It is a faith that does not demand guarantees, that does not set conditions, that does not negotiate with God. And when someone reaches that level, something changes completely. Fear loses strength because faith no longer depends on what can happen. Insecurity decreases because trust is not in the circumstances. And a different peace begins to emerge, a stability that is not easily shaken. Daniel 3:18. And if not, be it known, O king, that we will not serve your gods. That is the statement of a mature faith. A faith that is not waiting for a miracle to continue, but that remains firm, regardless of what lies ahead. And maybe, somehow, you're being challenged in exactly that area, a situation that requires positioning, a pressure that tries to make you retreat, a decision that seems too difficult, but that's where your faith can become stronger than ever. Maybe you've been waiting for an answer for a long time, and that moment may be just what God is using to strengthen something within you that no circumstance can destroy. Stay until the end, because what is yet to be revealed can completely change the way you face all this. There is a kind of waiting that is tiring, not just because of the time that passes, but because of the feeling that nothing is happening. You pray, you believe, you try to keep hope. But the days continue to follow, and what was promised seems distant, almost impossible. And it is in this space that many begin to doubt, not only the promise, but themselves, because waiting requires more than patience. It requires constant faith. And maintaining this faith when there are no visible signs is one of the greatest challenges of the spiritual life. The mind begins to question, the heart oscillates, and the desire to give up appears in a subtle way, as if it were just a way to protect oneself from frustration. But there is something that needs to be clearly understood. God's timing does not work like ours. What seems to take time is often preparation. What looks like silence is often alignment. And what seems to be standing still may be being built in a way that you can't see yet. Honoring God in everything includes trusting in this process, not just when things are happening, but especially when they're not. It is to continue believing even without evidence. It is to remain firm even without results. It is to sustain hope when everything around tries to weaken it. And that doesn't mean there won't be moments of doubt. They exist. But the difference is in not allowing these doubts to become decisions, because when someone decides to stay, even without understanding, something begins to strengthen inside. There is a spiritual maturity that is only born in waiting, a trust that does not depend on signs, a faith that does not need constant confirmations. And when this develops, the promise is no longer just something you look forward to and becomes something you carry inside you. The most powerful thing is that God never fails in what he promises. It may not happen in the time you would like, it may not be the way you imagined, but it always happens at the right time. And when it happens, you realize that it wasn't a delay, it was precision. Hebrews 10:23, let us hold fast the confession of our hope, for he who promised is faithful. And perhaps, at this moment, you are exactly in that place of waiting. Holding a promise, trying not to give up even without seeing clear signs. But if this message reached you, it was not by chance. There is something being held within you right now, and if you want to continue receiving words that strengthen your faith on this path, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and stay connected, because each message can be just what you need to stay strong until you see the fulfillment of what God has already promised. There is a phase of life when everything seems to have lost its meaning. Plans that were not fulfilled, paths that did not work out, losses that left deep marks, and little by little hope becomes more fragile, more distant, as if believing again were too risky. Because when someone goes through repeated disappointments, the heart starts to protect itself. Stop hoping, stop dreaming, stop trusting as before. And this creates a life that is safe on the outside, but empty on the inside. An existence without great pain, but also without great expectations. But there is something that needs to be restored. Hope. Not that hope based on circumstances, which rises and falls according to what happens, but a hope that is born of a decision, a conscious choice to continue believing, even when there are no visible reasons. Honoring God in everything includes that. To remain faithful in difficult seasons, to keep walking when everything seems uncertain, to keep an open heart even after having been hurt. Because it is exactly in this type of posture that something begins to change. God does not work only with what is intact. He is an expert in rebuilding, restoring, rewriting stories that seemed closed. What has been lost does not define what can still be lived. What did not work out does not determine what can still happen. And the most powerful thing is that this transformation begins even before circumstances change. It starts within. When you decide not to give in to discouragement, when you choose to believe again, when you allow God to rekindle something that seemed erased. True hope is not a passing feeling, it is a spiritual posture. It is to look forward even when the past weighs heavily. It is to trust even when logic does not help. It is to remain even when it would be easier to give up. And when someone lives that way, something starts to line up. Paths that seemed closed begin to open, unexpected encounters happen, new opportunities arise, not as a coincidence, but as a result of a life that decided not to stop. Ruth 2:12. May the Lord reward your deed and your reward from the Lord God of Israel be fulfilled. And maybe, right now, you're just in that kind of season, trying to move on, even with doubts, even with uncertainties, even with marks from the past. But there is something being built, even if you can't see it completely yet. Because when hope is renewed by God, history never ends where the pain began. It always points to a new beginning that is still being prepared. There are battles that cannot be resolved with human effort, situations where the more you try to control it, the more everything seems to fall out of place. You think, plan, fight, insist, but nothing changes. And this generates a deep tiredness, a feeling of helplessness that gradually consumes, because we have been taught to react, to fight, to try to take matters into our own hands. But there is a type of war that does not respond to force, does not bend to logic, cannot be resolved with human strategy. And it is at this point that many get frustrated, because they are using the wrong tool for the type of battle they are facing. Honoring God in everything is also recognizing when to stop fighting your way and start trusting in His work. And that doesn't mean giving up, it means changing positions. Stop trying to control and start surrendering. And this surrender is not weakness, it is spiritual understanding. There is a power in worship that few really access. Because many worship only when everything is fine, when there are reasons, when the heart is light. But true worship happens when the scenario is the opposite, when the pressure is great, when everything seems to go wrong. Worshipping at these times is a spiritual statement. It is to say, even in the midst of difficulty, that God continues to be worthy. It is choosing to trust even without understanding. And this generates something invisible but extremely real. Environments begin to change, atmospheres are transformed. What seemed to be stuck begins to move unexpectedly, not because you solved it, but because God came into the situation in a different way. And the deeper thing is that many times, victory begins even before any visible change. It starts within you, in the peace that arises, in the trust that is established, in the certainty that regardless of what happens, God is in control. When a person learns to worship in the midst of battle, he is no longer dominated by circumstances. The problem may even remain there for a while, but it no longer has the same weight. It no longer controls emotions. It no longer defines decisions. 2 Chronicles 20:22. And while they began to sing and give praise, the Lord laid ambushes against their enemies. And perhaps, at this moment, what you need most is not more effort, but a change of attitude. Maybe it's not about fighting harder, but about surrendering more deeply. Few people will fully understand this, but if this message has found you now, it is because there is something being aligned within your spirit. Open your heart and keep going, because what is yet to come can transform the way you face each battle starting today. There is a level of spiritual maturity that goes beyond one's own needs. A place where the person stops looking only at their own life and begins to feel the weight of something bigger. It is not something forced. It is not an obligation. It is a sensitivity that is born within the heart. Because most people pray when they need to, seek when they miss it, cry out when they are going through difficulties. And this is natural. But there is a deeper dimension, where one begins to stand up not only for oneself, but for others. Where the pain of the other also becomes a reason for prayer. Where the need of the other also becomes a calling. Honoring God in everything includes this kind of posture. Not to live a faith limited to one's own world, but to expand one's heart, to carry what God wants to transform around us. And this completely changes the way we relate to Him, because intercession is not just speaking words, it is feeling. It's getting involved, it's really caring. It's allowing your heart to be touched by situations that may not even be directly linked to your life. And this reveals something profound: alignment. When someone begins to intercede, they begin to see differently. Situations that previously went unnoticed now generate concern. People who were once just part of the environment now become a reason for prayer. There is a greater connection, a more sensitive perception, and the most powerful thing is that intercession happens on a level that is not visible. There is no applause, there is no recognition, often no one knows. But in the spiritual world, something is being moved. Decisions are being influenced, paths are being prepared, answers are being released. There is an impact that goes beyond what can be seen. Because when someone stands in prayer, they are not just talking, they are participating in something bigger. He is placing himself as an instrument, as someone available for God to work through his surrender. And this also requires resignation. Time, attention, willingness, because interceding is not something automatic, it is intentional. It is to stop, it is to dedicate oneself, it is to choose to carry something that would not be mandatory, but that becomes essential for those who want to live a deeper faith. Nehemiah 1:4. And it came to pass, when I heard these words, that I sat down and wept and mourned for some days, and I fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. And perhaps without realizing it, you are being awakened to it. A different sensitivity, a heavy heart for someone, a willingness to pray that wasn't there before. This is not common, this is a calling. Because when someone decides to stand up for others, they begin to live a dimension of honor that goes beyond the individual and touches the heart of God directly. There is a level of relationship with God that goes beyond words, beyond requests, beyond specific moments. It is a place where His presence ceases to be something you seek occasionally and becomes something you constantly carry. It's no longer about doing something for God, it's about living with Him. And this is deeper than it seems, because many people have become accustomed to living a faith based on actions, praying at certain times, seeking in specific situations, remembering God when they need something. But there is a different dimension, where God is not just part of life. He is the center of it. Honoring God in everything comes to this point, where it is no longer just a matter of obeying or following principles, but of developing a continuous communion, a constant awareness of His presence in every detail, in every decision, in every thought. And that changes everything, because when someone starts living like this, they no longer need big signs to feel connected. It does not depend on intense emotions to know that God is near. There is a silent certainty, a constant peace, a presence that does not move away. The most interesting thing is that this intimacy is not linked to great deeds. It doesn't depend on recognition. It doesn't need visibility. It happens in the simple, in everyday life, in the most ordinary moments. It is built on a daily basis, in the choice to keep the heart aligned, to keep the mind connected, to keep the life sensitive. And when that communion becomes real, something begins to change from the inside out. Decisions become clearer, thoughts more aligned, attitudes more conscious, not by effort but by influence, because those who walk with God begin to reflect what they receive from Him. There is a transformation that does not come from obligation, but from proximity. The closer you are, the more similar you become, and this happens naturally, without forcing, without weighing it down. And perhaps the deepest point of all this is to understand that when God's presence becomes sufficient, everything else loses the need to fill. Anxiety decreases, the search for validation loses strength, and a new way of living begins to emerge. Genesis 5:24, "And Enoch walked with God, and he appeared no more, because God took him to Himself." And perhaps at this moment, you are being invited to live this type of relationship. Not just moments with God, but a walk with Him. Something constant, real, transformative. If this message confirmed something within you, write in the comments, "I trust in God's action." State this as a decision to live not only for God, but with Him in every moment of your life. There is a level of gratitude that does not depend on what is happening on the outside. A gratitude that is not born of good moments, achievements or responses received, but of an internal decision. And this is one of the most profound expressions of honor to God, because it goes against everything that is natural. The natural thing is to be thankful when everything is fine, when things work out, when there are visible reasons, when life is light. But what about when it is not? And when the scenario is difficult, when the answers do not arrive, when the heart is tired? This is exactly where gratitude becomes powerful, because giving thanks in the midst of pain is not about ignoring what is happening. It is about recognizing that God remains who He is, regardless of the circumstances. It is a posture that declares, even if I don't understand, even if I don't see it, I continue to trust. And this transforms the environment, not just around, but inside you. Because when someone decides to say thank you, even for no apparent reason, something starts to align internally. The focus changes, the way of seeing changes, the way of reacting changes. Gratitude has this power to break negative cycles, to prevent the mind from being dominated by discouragement, to prevent the heart from closing, to keep the connection with God alive, even in difficult times. It does not deny pain, but prevents pain from having the last word. Honoring God in everything includes this kind of maturity, not to live based only on what you feel, but on what you believe. Not only react to what happens, but choose a posture that keeps the heart aligned. And the most interesting thing is that gratitude, when experienced in this way, begins to generate something beyond what is expected. Environments change, situations transform, paths begin to open, not as a formula, but as a result of a life that remains connected with God, regardless of the scenario. Because when someone continues to praise even in the midst of difficulty, they are declaring a confidence that goes beyond words. He is living a faith that does not depend on favorable circumstances to exist. Acts 16:25. And about midnight Paul and Silas prayed and sang hymns to God, and the rest of the prisoners listened to them. And perhaps at this moment, you are exactly at a stage where giving thanks seems difficult, where to look around doesn't bring many reasons, but that's precisely where there is an opportunity to experience something deeper. Because when gratitude becomes a lifestyle, it stops depending on what happens and starts to reveal who you have become before God. There is something silent that keeps many people from a deeper experience with God, and almost no one notices. It's not a lack of faith, it's not a lack of effort, it's not even a lack of desire. It is the excess of oneself, a constant need for control, recognition, to be right, to appear, to be seen. And that seems normal because the world values exactly that, to be recognized, to be admired, to be highlighted. But on the spiritual path, this logic is completely reversed. Because the more someone tries to exalt themselves, the more they distance themselves from what really matters. Honoring God in everything goes through a principle that directly confronts the ego. Diminish. Not in the sense of devaluing oneself, but of recognizing the right place of each thing. Understand that life isn't about yourself, that it's not about getting credit, that it's not about being the center. And this is challenging because the ego does not like to lose space. He wants to be fed, he wants to be recognized, he wants to have control. But as long as he dominates, God's presence does not manifest itself deeply. Not because God moves away, but because there is no space. True humility creates that space. When someone decides not to seek recognition, not to compete, not to put themselves above, something begins to change. The heart becomes lighter, the mind more tranquil, and a new sensitivity begins to emerge. Because humility is not weakness, it is alignment. It is recognizing that everything comes from God, that everything depends on Him, that nothing makes sense outside of this connection. And when this awareness becomes real, the way of living changes completely. Attitudes become simpler, words more careful, intentions purer. There is no longer a need to prove something, to compete for space, to attract attention. There is a silent security that does not need external validation. And it is exactly in this place that something powerful happens. God reveals Himself in a clearer, closer, more real way. Because where there is humility, there is space. Where there is space, there is presence. And where there is presence, everything begins to transform. John 3:30, He must increase, and I must decrease. And maybe, without realizing it, God is inviting you to this kind of positioning right now. Not to lose something, but to make room for something bigger. Because when you decide to decrease, you don't disappear. You finally align yourself with that which truly has eternal value. There are pains that do not go away over time, they just hide. Wounds that remain open inside, even when on the outside everything seems resolved. And the most difficult thing is that, many times, the person learns to live with it, to move forward carrying a silent weight that no one sees. Because forgiving is not something natural. When someone hurts deeply, the first reaction is to protect themselves, to close themselves off. Sometimes even to desire justice in their own way. The mind relives what happened, the heart resists, and the feeling seems to justify the pain. But there is a truth that transforms everything. As long as you hold on to the hurt, you remain attached to what happened, not because the other person still has power over you, but because the wound is still active within you. Honoring God in everything includes this level of decision. Not only do what is easy, but choose what liberates. And forgiveness does just that. It doesn't change the past, it doesn't erase what happened, but it changes what it continues to cause inside you. And this is profound, because forgiving is not saying that it was fair, it is not pretending that it did not hurt, it is not accepting the mistake, it's deciding not to carry that anymore. It's letting go of a weight that has been consuming you for too long. The most challenging thing is that many times the person waits to feel the urge to forgive and then acts. But forgiveness does not begin with feelings, it begins with decision. And as that decision is made, something begins to adjust within the heart. There is a freedom that only those who forgive know. A lightness that cannot be explained, only lived. Because what used to take up space, that generated pain, that held thoughts, begins to lose strength. And the most amazing thing is that when you release forgiveness, you make room for God to act in a way that was not possible before. Because hurt blocks, hardens, limits, but forgiveness liberates, softens, transforms. Genesis 50:20. You meant evil against me, but God has made it good. And maybe there's something inside of you that needs to be released. A name, a situation, a memory that still weighs. And this is not by chance. There is an invitation being made now, not to ignore the pain, but not to continue carrying it. Because what today seems like a wound can, in God's hands, become part of a restored history. But that starts when you decide to let go. In the next few moments, something even deeper will be revealed, something that can touch exactly the areas you have not yet been able to resolve. Stay, because this message may be the missing key for a real transformation to happen within you. There is a silent pressure trying to shape the way you live. It is not something explicit all the time, but it is present in the choices that seem normal, in the behaviors that are accepted, in the ideas that become common. And without realizing it, many people are adapting, adjusting their values, giving in little by little, until they can no longer distinguish what is right from what has just become habitual. Because living in line with God in an otherwise contrary environment is not automatic. It requires a decision. It requires awareness. It requires positioning. And this positioning will not always be comfortable because it often goes against the flow, against what the majority does, against what seems easiest. Honoring God in everything includes this daily choice to live differently. Not different by appearance, not to stand out, but different by conviction. It is knowing that not everything that is common is right, and not everything that is accepted is aligned with God's will. And this does not mean moving away from people or living in isolation. On the contrary, it means being present, but without getting lost. It is to maintain firm values, even in unstable environments. It is not to negotiate principles, even when no one is looking. Practical holiness is not only in big decisions, but in the details of everyday life. In the way you speak, how you react, how you think, how you choose. These are small attitudes that, added together, build an aligned life. And the most challenging thing is that no one can do it for you. It doesn't depend on the environment. It doesn't depend on the people around. It doesn't depend on the circumstances. It is a personal, constant, often silent choice. But there is something powerful about it. Because when someone decides to live like this, something naturally starts to stand out. You don't need to announce, you don't need to prove it. It simply becomes visible. There is a difference, a firmness, a clarity that does not go unnoticed. And this difference does not come from human effort. It comes from alignment. It comes from a life that decided not to mold itself to what is around it, but to stay connected with something bigger. Genesis 6:9. Noah was a righteous man and perfect throughout his generations. Noah walked with God. And perhaps right now you are being confronted in exactly this area. Small choices, small adjustments, decisions that seem simple, but that define much more than they seem. Because living apart isn't about cutting yourself off from the world. It's about not allowing the world to define who you become before God. There is a type of challenge that seems bigger than you. Situations that intimidate, that make you question if you are really capable, if you have enough strength, if you will be able to cope. And in view of this, the most common reaction is to retreat, avoid, hope that somehow it will disappear. But there is a difference between looking at a problem with fear and looking with faith. Because when someone sees only with their natural eyes, everything seems bigger, more difficult, more threatening. The problem grows, confidence decreases, and the person feels small in the face of the situation. Honoring God in everything includes changing this way of seeing. Do not deny reality, but do not limit yourself to it. It is to understand that not every battle is just natural, that there is something spiritual happening at the same time. And this completely changes the posture. Spiritual courage is not born from the absence of fear, but from the certainty of who God is. It is looking at a difficult situation and still trusting. It is to feel the weight of the challenge, but not allow it to define your decision. It is moving forward even when logic tells you to stop. And this is not impulsiveness, it is positioning. Because those who understand that God is present are not based only on what they see, but on what they believe. There is a confidence that does not come from one's own ability, but from the awareness that one is not alone. The most interesting thing is that many times, the size of the challenge reveals the level of opportunity. What seems like an obstacle may be the very scenario where God will be most prominently glorified. But this only happens when someone decides not to back down. There is a time when you have to choose. Keep looking at the problem or start looking at God. Because these two visions do not coexist in the same way. The more you focus on the size of the difficulty, the smaller you feel. But the more you focus on God, the more your faith is strengthened. And this change in focus changes everything. The way of thinking, of reacting, of deciding. What once seemed impossible is beginning to be faced with a different attitude, not because it has become easier, but because you have stopped depending only on yourself. 1 Samuel 17:45. You come to me with a sword, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts. And perhaps at this moment there is a giant in front of you, something that has taken away your peace, that has generated fear, that seems greater than you can bear. But this situation did not appear by chance, because when spiritual courage is activated, what seemed like a limit becomes a turning point. And how you choose to face it can reveal a level of faith that you have not yet experienced. There is one area of life that reveals more about your faith than many words: what you are willing to surrender. Because it's easy to talk about trust, it's easy to declare faith, but when the time comes to let go of something real, something that has value, something that brings security, that's where the heart is exposed. True generosity does not begin with excess, it begins with surrender. And this directly confronts the way many people live, because the natural tendency is to guard, protect, hold. There is a silent fear of lacking, of losing, of not having enough. And this fear often prevents a person from living a deeper level of trust in God. Honoring God in everything includes this dimension, not only trust with words, but trust with attitudes. Deliver time, resources, attention, willingness, not out of obligation, but out of understanding. Because when someone recognizes that everything comes from God, they also understand that everything can be placed in His hands. And this isn't about quantity, it's about heart. It's not about how much you have, but about how much you trust. Because it is possible to give a lot and still not trust, just as it is possible to give little and still be giving everything. There is something powerful when generosity is born of faith. When the person decides to give up not on impulse but out of conviction, when he understands that God is not limited by what he has, but that he is able to supply, multiply, and take care of everything that is necessary. And the deepest thing about this is that generosity does not only transform those who receive, it transforms those who deliver. Because it breaks attachment, dismantles fear, strengthens trust. Each act of surrender becomes a step toward a more mature faith. Often what holds a person back is not a lack of resources, but attachment to them. And when this is broken, a new freedom arises. The person stops living in fear of losing and starts to live with confidence that God is enough. Mark 12:43-44. This poor widow gave more than all, because he gave all he had. And perhaps right now, God is touching exactly that area of your life. Not just what you can give, but what you need to rely on. Because there is a level of honor that is only achieved when you decide to deliver, even without guarantees. At the end of this path, something deeper will be revealed. A connection that goes beyond what you've experienced so far. Stay until the end, because that may be the time when you will feel God's presence in a way that you have never felt before. There is a type of fatigue that does not come from physical exertion, but from prolonged waiting. It's when you keep going, insist, stay. But the results do not appear. The days go by, the months go by, sometimes even years, and the feeling is of being in the same place. And it is exactly at this point that many give up. Because getting started is easy when there is motivation, staying is easy when there are results, but continuing when nothing seems to change requires something much deeper. It requires perseverance. And this is one of the greatest proofs of true faith. Honoring God in everything includes this ability to remain, even when there are no visible signs of advancement. It's about continuing to believe when time passes. It is not to abandon what God has said, even when everything around seems to contradict it. The problem is that time tests the heart. It reveals intentions, exposes motivations, confronts expectations. Because in the beginning, faith is strong, trust is clear, hope is alive. But as time goes by, doubts arise, the mood fluctuates, and the desire to give up begins to appear silently. And it is at this moment that a decision needs to be made. Not based on what you are seeing, but on what you believe. Because those who live only on results cannot stay for long, but those who live by conviction continue, even when they don't understand. There is something that only time can build, a mature faith. A faith that does not depend on emotions, that is not shaken by delays, that is not weakened by the absence of immediate responses. A faith that remains firm because it is grounded in something greater. And when one develops this kind of perseverance, something begins to strengthen within him. Anxiety subsides, haste loses strength, and a more solid confidence begins to emerge. Not based on time, but on God's faithfulness, because what God has promised is not lost in time. It may seem distant, it may seem time-consuming, but it is still real. And time does not annul the promise, it only prepares those who will receive it. Joshua 14:12. Now, therefore, give me this mountain of which the Lord spoke that day. And maybe right now you're right at that stage, continuing, even tired, believing, even with doubts, remaining, even without seeing clear results. And this is not in vain. Nothing in this life happens without a purpose. If that word has come to you now, there is something being confirmed within your heart. If you feel this, write in the comments, I believe, Lord. State this as a decision not to give up, because your perseverance may be closer to the answer than you realize. After all that has been revealed so far, one thing becomes clear. It is no longer possible to remain in the same place. Every word, every teaching, every inner confrontation has brought you to this point for a reason, because there comes a time when listening is no longer enough. It is necessary to decide. Faith is no longer just something you feel and becomes something you live. And this decision cannot be postponed. It cannot be transferred. It cannot be ignored. What has been awakened within you now is not by chance. There is a silent call for an answer, an invitation to step out of theory and into a life truly aligned with God. Because honoring God in everything is not a distant concept, it is a daily choice that begins in the heart. Deuteronomy 30:19, "Choose life, therefore, that you and your descendants may live." Now, this is the time to truly open your heart, to put aside distractions, worries, and resistance. Let's go into prayer, surrendering everything to God with confidence, knowing that He is present, listening, and ready to act. Beloved Father, your presence is real at this moment, and your word has the power to transform all that is within us. You are God who sees the heart, who knows every thought, and who calls us to a life of honor, truth, and surrender. Lord, I thank you for every teaching received so far, for every word that touched the heart, for every truth that brought light where there was doubt before. Thank you that you don't leave us in the same place, but call us to a deeper level of relationship with you. Thank you that even when we fail, your grace reaches us and gives us the opportunity to start over. Now, God, I ask you, strengthen this heart that prays, give wisdom to live all that has been learned, courage to make decisions that honor you, and faith to continue even when it is difficult. It teaches to trust you at all times, to hear your voice clearly, and to obey without reservation. Father, visit now every area of life that needs intervention. It brings healing to those who are wounded, relief to those who are weary, peace to those who are anxious. It restores families, opens doors where there is no way, provides for those facing financial difficulties, and renews the strength of those who have already thought about giving up. May your presence reach every need, visible and invisible. At this moment in silence, each heart presents itself before you. Every request, every pain, every desire, everything is being placed in your hands. Lord, we have completely surrendered our lives to you. We surrender our fears, our plans, our dreams, and even what we cannot understand. May your will prevail above all. Shape our hearts, align our paths, and teach us to live in a way that honors you in every detail. Create in us, Father, a pure heart, sensitive to your voice, willing to obey you. It renews our interior, strengthens our spirit, and leads us on a path of truth, holiness, and purpose. May we never lose awareness of your presence, and may each day be lived as an act of adoration. Psalm 51:10. Create in me, O God, a clean heart, and renew in me a right spirit. And may your peace, which is beyond all understanding, guard every heart now. May there be rest, confidence, and renewed hope. We declare that we belong to you, and that we will live to honor you in everything. In Jesus' name, amen. If this prayer reflected what is in your heart, write Amen as a sign of your faith and surrender at this time. After all that has been revealed, one truth remains echoing within you. Honoring God in everything is not a detail, it is the purpose of your life. Every teaching you heard was not just information, it was direction. It was not just reflection, it was a calling. Because living for God does not happen by chance, it happens by decision. And this message is for you, not by coincidence, but because God chose you to hear this today and align your heart with something bigger than yourself. Now, the question that remains is not what you understood, but what you are going to do with it. How will these principles appear in your choices, in your attitudes, in your thoughts, when no one is watching? Because that's where honor becomes real. It is in daily life, in silence, in simple decisions that build a whole life before God. And perhaps this is the most important question of this moment. Are you willing to live in a way that truly honors God in everything? And let me tell you something with an open heart. It is a joy to have you here, being part of this journey. This is not just a video, it is a spiritual journey that we are living together. and you're not here by chance. So if this message spoke to you, take advantage of this moment and leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell to continue receiving these words that edify and strengthen. And I want to meet you too, right here in the comments of where you are watching, and if you feel in your heart, share a little of what you are experiencing. We're in this together, and your story matters. But that doesn't end here. There is something even deeper waiting for you. In the next video, we will go even further on this journey and dive into a dimension that can completely transform the way you live the presence of God in your daily life. Don't miss it, because the next step may be just what you need to live all that God has prepared. Allow God to continue speaking to your heart. Take the next step on this journey by watching the next video that will appear here on the screen. In it, we will continue to learn how to live in God's presence and experience the fullness of His plans. Don't stop here, because God still has much more to speak to you. Always remember, God is greater than any attack. Trust Him, and He will do infinitely more than you can imagine. May God bless your life, and I'll wait for you in the next video.